The afternoon sun hung heavy in the sky, casting long shadows on the empty road where Maya had been driving just moments before. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, as the flashing blue lights in her rearview mirror reflected a sudden reality that filled her with dread. This wasn't supposed to happen. She hadn't done anything wrong. Yet here she was, her heart pounding in her chest as Officer Jenkins' squad car pulled up behind her. Instinctively, Maya placed her hand on her belly, feeling the soft curve that had grown steadily over the past 5 months. The tiny life inside her was her constant companion now, and every decision she made was no longer just about her. It was about her child too. Taking a deep breath, she tried to calm herself, recalling everything she had been taught about encounters like this. Stay polite, stay calm, follow instructions. She was just another driver on the road, and this was just a routine stop. But as Officer Jenkins approached her car, there was something unsettling in the air, something cold and dangerous. His steps were measured, but his presence loomed large, casting a shadow over Maya's small sedan. The hostility radiating from him was palpable, and the way his hand hovered over the holster on his hip set every nerve in Maya's body on edge. She could feel the threat before a single word had been spoken. "License and registration," Jenkins barked, his voice void of any warmth or professionalism. Maya's hands trembled as she reached into her purse, her movements slow and deliberate, careful not to make any sudden gestures that could be misinterpreted. Her fingers fumbled with the documents, her heart pounding louder with each passing second. When she finally handed them over, she tried to explain herself, her voice shaking. I wasn't speeding," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't understand why I was pulled over." Jenkins barely glanced at the papers in his hand. His eyes flicked up to meet hers, locking onto her with a look so intense it made her skin crawl. There was no courtesy, no sense of duty in his gaze, only contempt. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his tone flat and commanding, as if her words hadn't registered with him at all.
Maya's heart skipped a beat. Step out of the vehicle. She hadn't done anything wrong. There was no reason for her to get out of the car. She wasn't a threat. She was just driving home. A pregnant woman on her way back from work. Why was this happening?
"Officer," Maya began, her voice shaky but soft, "I'm pregnant." She gestured toward her belly, hoping that this simple fact might humanize her in his eyes. But Jenkins didn't flinch. "I said, get out of the car," he repeated, louder this time, his hand moving to rest on the baton at his waist. The lack of compassion, the lack of understanding was like a physical blow. It didn't matter to him that she was pregnant, or that she hadn't broken any laws. What mattered was that she complied. Fear coursed through Maya's veins, but she willed herself to remain calm. She had to stay in control of the situation, no matter how terrified she felt. "Officer, please," she tried again, her voice small and pleading. "I don't understand why." "I don't have to explain myself to you," Jenkins spat, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Step out of the car, or I'll make you get out." The words hit her like a slap. Maya froze, her heart hammering in her chest. This wasn't just a routine stop. This was personal. The way he was looking at her, it wasn't about upholding the law. It was about power. Maya had seen that look before, in the eyes of men who saw her blackness as a threat, who saw her humanity as something they could easily dismiss. With a deep breath, Maya unlatched her seatbelt and reached for the door handle. Her fingers trembled as she opened the door and slowly stepped out of the car, her legs feeling weak beneath her. She kept her hand on her belly, holding it as if to shield her unborn child from the hatred of Jenkins. As soon as she was standing, Jenkins moved closer, his imposing figure towering over her. He was so close now that Maya could feel his breath, sharp and harsh, as his eyes roamed over her, full of disdain.
"What are you hiding?" he growled, his hand still resting on the baton, ready to pull it at a pulse notice.
Maya's heart raced, confusion clouding her mind. What was he talking about? "I'm not hiding anything," she whispered, her voice shaking with fear. "I'm just trying to get home." But Jenkins wasn't listening. His mind was already made up. She was guilty of something, and he was determined to make her pay for it. His lip curled in a sneer, and his voice dropped to a menacing growl. "Don't lie to me," he said, leaning in closer. "I know your type. You people think you can get away with anything." The words sent a cold shiver down Maya's spine. Your type. She knew exactly what he meant, and the realization was like a punch to the gut. This wasn't about a traffic violation. This was about the color of her skin. In Jenkins' eyes, she wasn't a person. She was a target. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them back. She couldn't afford to cry, not now. Not in front of him. Crying would make her seem weak, and weakness was something Jenkins would use against her. "I'm not doing anything wrong," Maya whispered, barely able to get the words out. Her voice was trembling, but she stood her ground. She wouldn't run. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Jenkins' eyes narrowed, his hand tightening on his baton. "Get on the ground," he barked. Maya's breath caught in her throat. On the ground? She looked down at her swollen belly, then back at Jenkins, disbelief washing over her. She couldn't. She physically couldn't. "Officer," she stammered, her voice breaking, "I can't. I'm pregnant. Please." "I said, get on the ground." Jenkins roared, his face twisted in fury. The command hit her like a tidal wave, and for a split second, Maya was paralyzed by fear. Her legs trembled, her mind raced. What was happening? How had it come to this? Desperation welled up inside her as the reality of the situation crashed down. There was no reasoning with him. He wasn't interested in who she was or what she had to say. He had made up his mind the moment he saw her. She was just another black woman to be controlled. A sharp pain shot through Maya's abdomen, and she gasped, clutching her belly. The baby. Something was wrong. Panic surged in her chest as the pain intensified, and she doubled over, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But Jenkins didn't care. He wasn't listening. "Get on the ground," he demanded again, his voice like steel. Maya couldn't. She could barely breathe. The pain was too much, and she was terrified that something was happening to her child. With shaking hands, she reached for her phone, dialing the only number she could think of, her father. The phone rang once, then twice, before her father's voice crackled through the speaker. "Maya. Maya. Dad," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "Help me." And in that moment, as Officer Jenkins loomed over her, as the pain in her stomach grew unbearable, as the world around her seemed to spin out of control, Maya clung to one thing, the hope that her father would get there in time. As Maya stood beside her car, her heart raced, and every breath felt like a struggle. The quiet road, which had felt so peaceful moments earlier, now felt like a hostile battleground, with Officer Jenkins looming over her. The fear that gripped her was like nothing she had ever experienced before, and she knew that she was no longer just protecting herself, she was protecting the fragile life inside her. Every instinct screamed for her to run, but where could she go? There was no escape from the power that Officer Jenkins held over her in that moment. "Get on the ground." Jenkins' voice boomed again, slicing through the stillness of the afternoon. His hand gripped his baton, knuckles white, eyes locked on her like a predator sizing up prey. The command wasn't just an order, it was a show of dominance, a reminder of who held the power. To Jenkins, Maya wasn't a person with thoughts, fears, or a future. She was an object to be controlled, a threat to be neutralized. Maya's legs wobbled beneath her, the weight of her pregnancy making it difficult to stand, let alone comply with Jenkins' cruel demand. Her mind raced, replaying every detail of the encounter. She hadn't been speeding. She hadn't broken any laws. Why was this happening? "Officer, please," she said, her voice trembling as she held her swollen belly. "I'm 5 months pregnant. I can't get on the ground." Jenkins' eyes narrowed with disdain, his lips curling in a sneer. "I don't care," he spat. "You people think you can get away with anything."
The words hung in the air, thick with hatred. "You people." Maya's stomach churned with nausea at the blatant racism in his voice. She had heard stories about people like Jenkins' officers who abused their power, targeting black people because of the color of their skin. But to be on the receiving end of such hatred, to feel it so viscerally, was something she could never have prepared for.
Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one more terrifying than the last. What if he hurt her? What if something happened to the baby? The thought of her child suffering because of Jenkins' hatred held her full of a mixture of fear and anger. She was desperate to protect her unborn baby. But how could she when the person meant to uphold the law was the one threatening her? Jenkins took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. He towered over her, the sneer on his face deepening. "You think being pregnant is going to get you out of this?" His voice dripped with malice, each word hitting Maya like a blow. "You think I care about your little sob story?" Maya's chest tightened, the tears she had been holding back threatening to spill over. She had never felt so powerless, so completely at the mercy of someone who viewed her life as disposable. Her thoughts were consumed with her child, the innocent life that hadn't even entered the world yet, and yet was already facing the weight of systemic racism. "I'm just trying to go home," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "Please, I haven't done anything wrong." But Jenkins wasn't listening. He wasn't interested in the truth. His mind was made up the moment he saw her, a black woman, alone on an empty road. To him, she was guilty by default, a target for his pent-up rage. "Stop resisting," Jenkins shouted, reaching for her arm, gripping it tightly with one hand while the other hovered over his baton. Maya gasped at the sudden force, pain shooting through her as he yanked her closer. She stumbled, her balance shaky as she tried to protect her belly, her mind screaming with fear. "Please, you're hurting me," she cried out, her voice filled with desperation.
But her words only seemed to enrage him further. His grip tightened, and Maya could see the veins in his neck bulging as his face twisted with anger. Jenkins had decided that Maya was resisting, that she was a threat, and nothing she said or did could change his mind. His grip on her arm was painful, and Maya could feel the pressure building in her abdomen, the strain on her body too much to bear.
Suddenly, from the corner of her eye, Maya noticed something. A small group of people had begun to gather at a distance. They had seen the flashing lights, the escalating tension, and now they were watching, some with phones raised, recording everything. Maya's heart lifted ever so slightly at the sight. Maybe someone would intervene. Maybe someone would see the injustice of what was happening.
One voice from the crowd rang out, cutting through the tense silence. "She's pregnant. Leave her alone."
For a brief moment, Jenkins hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the growing crowd. But then, his face hardened, and Maya could see the anger flaring in his eyes. He wasn't going to back down. If anything, the presence of witnesses seemed to fuel his need to assert control. "This is a police matter," Jenkins growled, his voice cold and authoritative. "Back off, or you'll be arrested too." The crowd murmured, unsure whether to step in or stay back. They knew something was wrong, but the sight of Jenkins, with his hand on his baton, the flashing police lights, and the weight of authority on his side, made them hesitate. The phone stayed raised, recording every second, every word, capturing the moment that would soon become so much more than a simple traffic stop. Maya's body ached, every muscle tense from fear and pain. She could feel the weight of Jenkins' grip, the coldness of his gaze, and the indifference in his voice. She wanted to scream, to fight back, to do something to protect herself and her baby, but she was paralyzed by the realization that Jenkins held all the power in that moment, and that power was rooted in hatred. Tears blurred her vision, but she blinked them away. She had to stay strong. She had to survive this for her child. But the fear was suffocating, wrapping around her like a vise, tightening with every second that passed. As Maya's voice trembled with fear, the world around her seemed to move in slow motion. Every breath felt labored as Officer Jenkins' towering figure loomed closer, casting an oppressive shadow over her. Her hand remained on her swollen belly, an instinctive gesture to protect the life growing inside her from a force she had no control over. The growing tension in the air was suffocating, and in that moment it felt like she was utterly alone, left to face Jenkins' unchecked rage. But she wasn't alone. And behind the wall of flashing blue lights and Jenkins' snarling demands, something was shifting. Maya could feel it, even through the haze of fear. A quiet murmur had begun to ripple through the otherwise deserted road, a murmur that grew louder with each passing second. At first it was just a few scattered voices, whispers carried by the wind. Then, the murmurs turned into shouts, sharp and clear, cutting through the oppressive air like a lifeline.
"She's pregnant," someone in the crowd yelled.
Maya's heart leapt. The crowd. They had gathered quietly at first, drawn by the flashing lights and the unmistakable sense that something was wrong. But now they were finding their voice. What had started as a few onlookers was quickly growing into something bigger, a sea of faces filled with concern, confusion, and, most importantly, righteous anger. And they weren't going to stay silent. Phones were held high, recording everything. The onlookers knew this was more than just a traffic stop gone wrong. They could see it in the way Jenkins' face twisted with anger, the way his hand gripped at Maya's arm as if she were a criminal, not a pregnant woman pleading for mercy. They had seen too many moments like this, too many encounters between black people and law enforcement that ended in tragedy. And this time they were determined not to let that happen.
Maya could feel their support, even though she didn't know any of them personally. The collective energy of the crowd gave her strength. She was no longer standing on that road alone. There were witnesses now, people who wouldn't let this injustice go unnoticed.
"Back off," a voice from the crowd shouted, firm and unyielding. "She didn't do anything." Jenkins glanced over his shoulder at the growing number of people. His sneer faltered for just a second, the confidence in his authority momentarily shaken by the sheer number of eyes on him. The crowd wasn't backing down. and the phones pointed in his direction were capturing everything. But then, as if regaining his footing, Jenkins straightened, his hand still hovering dangerously close to his baton. His voice was laced with venom as he barked at the crowd. "This is a police matter. Back off, or you'll be arrested." The threat echoed in the air, but the crowd didn't scatter. They had seen this before, officers using intimidation and fear to silence witnesses. But today was different. The people in the crowd, each of them, were fueled by something bigger than fear. They were fueled by the knowledge that their silence would only allow this abuse of power to continue. And so they stood their ground. A woman at the front of the crowd, her phone held high, shouted back, "We're not going anywhere. You can't get away with this." Maya felt a tear slip down her cheek, not from fear this time, but from the overwhelming relief that these strangers were standing up for her. They were standing up for her unborn child. And in that moment she knew that this wasn't just about her anymore, it was about something much larger. It was about every person who had ever been in her position, every person who had ever faced the oppressive weight of systemic racism and abuse of power. The crowd surged forward, closing the gap between themselves and the scene unfolding in front of them. The tension in the air was thick, almost tangible, as more voices joined in, demanding that Jenkins back down. Maya could feel the pressure building, Jenkins' grip on her arm tightening as the crowd's anger grew. "This isn't right," a man in the crowd yelled. "She's pregnant, and you're attacking her for no reason." Jenkins' face flushed with anger, but beneath the bravado, Maya could see the cracks in his facade. The weight of the crowd, the cameras, the phones, all of it was starting to sink in. He couldn't simply sweep this under the rug. This time there would be no quick escape, no simple explanation to justify his actions. The world was watching, and for the first time Jenkins realized he was losing control. Maya winced as Jenkins' hand tightened around her arm, his frustration boiling over. He wanted to maintain control. He wanted to show everyone that he was still in charge, but the crowd was no longer afraid of him. They were afraid for Maya, for what might happen to her and her unborn child if they didn't keep standing up for her. Suddenly, a new sound pierced the tension, the screech of tires as a black sub sped toward the scene. The flashing lights on top of the vehicle were unmistakable, but they didn't belong to another police officer coming to back up Jenkins. They belonged to someone else entirely. Someone who would not stand for this injustice. Chief Wilson. Maya's heart skipped a beat as the car came to a halt, and the door swung open. Her father, Chief Wilson, stepped out with an air of authority that commanded respect. His face was set in a hard line, his eyes scanning the scene with a controlled fury that made it clear something was about to change. The crowd, sensing the shift, grew quieter, their phones still recording but their focus now on the man who had arrived to restore order. Chief Wilson's eyes found Maya immediately, and in that brief moment, her fear melted away. Her father was here. He would make sure she was safe. But then Chief Wilson's gaze shifted to Jenkins, and the cold fury in his eyes was unmistakable. He didn't need to say a word to make it clear that what had happened was unacceptable. His presence alone was enough to shift the balance of power. Jenkins, who had held so much authority just moments before, now stood rigid, the weight of Chief Wilson's stare bearing down on him like a hammer. Chief Wilson walked slowly toward Jenkins, his footsteps deliberate and heavy with meaning. "Explain yourself." "Officer Jenkins," he said, his voice low and steady, but filled with an authority that could not be questioned. Jenkins blinked, the bravado draining from his face as he stammered, trying to find the words. "Says she was resisting arrest. I had to." Chief Wilson raised a hand, silencing him. "Enough." His voice was sharp, leaving no room for argument. He turned to Maya, his expression softening for just a moment as he took in the sight of his daughter, shaken but unharmed. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern.
Maya nodded, her breath still shaky. "I'm okay, Dad," she whispered, though the weight of everything that had happened still lingered in her voice. She glanced at Jenkins, who stood frozen in place, and added softly, I thought he was going to hurt me." Chief Wilson's jaw clenched, his eyes hardening once more as he turned back to Jenkins. "You're done," he said, his voice carrying the finality of a sentence. "You're under arrest."
The crowd, watching with bated breath, erupted into cheers, their relief and justice intertwined in a single, powerful moment. The phones kept recording, capturing the image of Jenkins being led away in handcuffs, the once confident officer now powerless in the face of accountability. Maya watched as the scene unfolded, her heart still racing but filled with a sense of peace. For the first time in what had felt like an eternity, she knew she was safe. She was surrounded by people who had stood up for her, by strangers who had become her allies in the fight for justice. But as the police car carrying Jenkins drove away, and the crowd began to disperse, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The battle against systemic racism, against the abuse of power, was far from won. This was just one victory in a much larger fight. She glanced at her father, who stood protectively by her side, and felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. But she also felt something deeper, a resolve to continue fighting, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been in her position. The sun was beginning to set over the city, casting long shadows across the street, where moments earlier the tension had reached a boiling point. The flashing blue lights of the police car that had once symbolized fear and oppression were now a distant glow, disappearing with Officer Jenkins in the backseat, handcuffed and powerless. Maya stood beside her father, Chief Wilson, her hand resting on her belly as she watched the scene unfold. The crowd, which had grown from a few concerned bystanders into a force of witnesses demanding justice, was slowly dispersing. Some lingered, exchanging quiet conversations. Others gave Maya nods of solidarity as they passed by, acknowledging the victory they had all just witnessed.
But for Maya, the victory felt bittersweet.
Her father turned to her, his expression still stern but softened by concern for his daughter. "You're safe now," he said, his voice gentle but steady. "He won't hurt you."
Maya nodded, but the weight of the moment still clung to her like a heavy coat. She was safe, yes. Jenkins had been taken away, and for the first time since that awful moment when his squad car had pulled up behind her, she could breathe without the crushing weight of fear. But there was a lingering ache in her chest that she couldn't shake. This wasn't just about one officer, one incident. This was about something much bigger, something that wouldn't fixed, just because one man was held accountable.
Her father seemed to sense her unease. "I know it's not enough," he said quietly, his eyes scanning the emptying street. "But it's a start." Maya looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. "I thought I was going to lose everything," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I thought he was going to hurt my baby." Chief Wilson's face tightened, his jaw clenching as he placed a protective hand on her shoulder. "No one is ever going to hurt you again," he promised. But there was a sadness in his eyes too. He knew, just as Maya did, that the world they lived in always kept that promise. No matter how much he wanted to protect her, there were battles she would have to face, battles that went beyond the reach of even the most powerful father. The reality of that truth weighed heavily on both of them. As the last few members of the crowd began to drift away, the street fell quiet again, leaving Maya and her father standing in the fading light of the day. The tension that had filled the air just an hour ago had dissipated, but the remnants of that fear still clung to Maya. She glanced down at her swollen belly, feeling the small movements of her unborn child, a reminder that she had more than just herself to protect now. "I can't believe this is the world I'm bringing my baby into," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. I thought things would be better by now." Chief Wilson exhaled, his face lined with the weariness of a man who had fought these battles for decades. "We've come a long way," he said, his voice calm but weighted. "But we've got a long way to go." Maya nodded, her mind swirling with thoughts of the future. The baby growing inside her deserved a world where they wouldn't have to fear encounters with people like Jenkins, where their skin color wouldn't be a target. But how could she promise her child that kind of world when she herself had just faced the brutal reality of its absence? As if reading her thoughts, Chief Wilson spoke again, his voice steady and filled with the wisdom of experience. "Change doesn't happen overnight, but every step forward, every time we stand up and refuse to be silenced, we get closer. What happened today, what you did today, that matters. It matters more than you know." Maya looked at her father, his face illuminated by the last rays of the setting sun. She knew he was right. The crowd had stood with her. Strangers had used their voices to demand justice, to record the truth, to make sure that what happened would not be swept under the rug. And now people across the world would see that video, would hear her story. They would see that a black woman, pregnant and vulnerable, had faced down the cruelty of systemic racism, and they would know that this time, justice had been served. But it was more than just about her. It was about every person who had ever been in her position and hadn't had a crowd there to protect them. It was about the countless stories of injustice that never made the news, that were never recorded on a phone, that were lost to the silence of a broken system. Maya took a deep breath, feeling the weight of that truth settle inside her. She had survived, but there were so many others who hadn't, and that was why this couldn't end here. "I want to do more," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she had fully formed the thought. "I don't want this to just be about today. I want to help change things." Her father looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and sadness. "You've already started," he said softly. "By standing up today, by surviving, you've already started." Maya shook her head, her determination growing with each passing moment. "It's not enough. I can't just go back to my life and pretend like this didn't happen. There are so many people out there who need someone to stand with them, like the crowd stood with me today." Chief Wilson smiled, the kind of smile that comes from seeing the strength in someone you love, even when it's born from pain. "I know," he said quietly, "and I'll stand with you every step of the way." The two of them stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of the day pressing down on them, but also the hope of something more, something better. The sky was darkening now, but in the distance, the city lights began to flicker on, casting a soft glow over the streets. Maya looked out at the city, at the world she was determined to help change, and felt a spark of resolve ignite within her. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. She had been through the fire, and now she knew, without a doubt, that she couldn't turn away. Not now. Not ever. "I want my child to grow up in a better world," she said, her voice steady and filled with purpose. "And I'm going to do everything I can to make that happen." Chief Wilson nodded, his eyes filled with pride. "And you will." The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the promise of change. The road ahead would be long and hard, but Maya knew she wouldn't walk it alone. She had her father, her community, and most importantly, she had the strength that had carried her through the darkest of days. As she and her father turned to leave, Maya glanced back one last time at the street where her life had almost changed forever, and in that moment, she made a silent promise to herself, to her child, and to every person who had ever faced the same injustice. The fight for justice wasn't over, but with every step, with every voice raised in defiance, they were getting closer. And Maya was ready to keep walking, ready to keep fighting. For herself, for her baby, for all of them.